Some stories don't begin with laughter, but with a kind glance shared between two strangers, and some meetings, seemingly accidental, end up changing the course of an entire life. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now, take a deep breath and let's step into this incredible journey together. In a city where glass towers rise quietly through morning fog and luxury cars glide like silver streaks in silence, there lived a man few truly understood, Lucas Martins. With a reserved presence and sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, Lucas wasn't the type to chase the spotlight. But in the world of upscale dining, his name held weight. A successful entrepreneur, the proud owner of a celebrated restaurant chain, known for his uncompromising standards and a personal motto. Food isn't just a meal, it's how we speak to the world. And that's exactly why a handwritten letter from a disgruntled customer stopped him in his tracks. The service at your Westbridge location isn't what it used to be. Something's rotting from the inside. I'm not asking for a refund. I just miss the place it used to be, where kindness mattered. Lucas folded the letter carefully. He didn't speak, but the faint crease between his brows revealed his thoughts were already racing. And, as with all important decisions in his life, he didn't call a meeting. He didn't send an email. He didn't even alert his executive team. He simply vanished. 2 days later, on a gray afternoon in the aging Westbridge district, a modestly dressed man walked into the restaurant. His coat was wrinkled, his posture humble, and no one paid him any attention. No one could have guessed this quiet stranger had once stood on stage accepting the Restaurant of the Year award. Lucas stepped past cracked floor tiles, the rubber sole of his shoe making a soft tap as it met a chipped edge. A small, almost poetic sound to mark the beginning of a journey even he couldn't fully anticipate. He wasn't here for show. He came to hear the things no one would ever say to a man in a suit. He came to see for himself what reports and numbers would never show him. And then, through the haze of fryer grease and the faint clinking of silverware, he saw her, a young woman, hair tied hastily back, hands moving in constant motion, and a tired smile that, despite everything, was genuine. Clara. Lucas didn't know it then, but stepping into that restaurant would lead him to something far greater than the problem he'd come to fix. Something not even a man as meticulous as him could have planned for, and inside what seemed to be the most broken restaurant in his empire. Lucas would discover something priceless, not profit, but a heart that refused to stop shining. The restaurant wasn't much to look at least not anymore. Once a charming neighborhood spot tucked into the edge of Westbridge, it now bore the slow wear of neglect. The paint near the windowsills had peeled, the chairs wobbled with use, and the lighting inside was tired, a little too dim to feel cozy, a little too bright to hide the truth. But just as Lucas was beginning to question why he'd come, she appeared. Clara. She moved with a rhythm that was rushed but graceful. Her ponytail, slightly undone from a long shift, bounced lightly with each step. Her hands were quick, balancing a tray, filling water, clearing a table, and her voice, though soft, carried a quiet confidence that cut through the noise. "Good afternoon," she said, offering him a smile that was neither forced nor obligatory. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've had a long day. But choose kindness anyway. Lucas didn't respond right away. There was something in her eyes. A weariness, yes, but layered beneath it, something brighter, something anchored, as if no matter how heavy the world pressed down on her, she'd still find a way to stand tall. She guided him to a table near the window, apologizing for the slight wobble in the leg, and asked if he'd like coffee while he looked over the menu. And just like that, she vanished into the blur of the lunch rush. But Lucas kept watching. He watched her navigate the chaos, not with perfection, but with grace. She checked in on every table. She crouched to pick up a toddler's dropped spoon without being asked. She offered a kind word to a grumpy elderly couple, and even poured water for a co-worker who looked close to tears. She wasn't performing. She was simply showing up in the truest sense. And for a man like Lucas, a man who'd spent decades dissecting customer service like a science, this was different. Clara wasn't serving food. She was serving people. With heart. With humanity. By the time his order arrived, Lucas had already decided he'd be coming back. Not just once, but again. And again. Not just for the food, or the mystery of what had gone wrong in this place, but because he needed to understand her. Because in a restaurant where everything seemed to be falling apart, she was holding it together. If you believe a kind smile can change someone's life, leave a comment below saying, "I believe," and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next in Clara's story. Lucas had always been good at reading people, not the way salesmen do, with charm and instinct, but with precision. The way a man reads fine print on a contract before signing. The way a chef tastes for balance without needing a second bite. So when Clara smiled at him, Lucas noticed. It wasn't joy. It was effort. A smile worn by someone who's learned to carry her world on tired shoulders and still chooses to be kind. He started to ask questions. Quietly, discreetly. A few words here, a bit of observation there. It didn't take long to gather the pieces, and once he had them, the picture was far from simple. Clara was 28. A single mother of 2 twin boys, 5 years old, both bright, both curious, and both unaware of how much their mother gave up just to keep their lives normal. Their father had left before they were even born, long gone the moment responsibility knocked on the door. She worked double shifts, morning prep to night close, 6 days a week. On the 7th day, she cleaned houses, because the restaurant paycheck was barely enough to cover rent, let alone growing kids, school supplies, and the rising cost of everything. She lived in a small studio apartment with a leaky faucet and windows that let in too much cold in the winter. The boys shared a mattress on the floor, side by side, nestled beneath mismatched blankets and hand-me-down stuffed animals. But somehow, she made it beautiful. There were drawings taped to the fridge, spaghetti dinners filled with laughter, bedtime stories read by flashlight when the power bill ran late. Clara gave them joy, even when she had none left for herself. Lucas saw all this, not in one sweeping scene, but in small, unspoken ways. He saw it in the way she checked her flip phone at the back hallway between tables, waiting for a daycare update. He saw it in the way she walked a little faster after each shift, knowing every minute mattered when you only had 1 hour before bedtime. He saw it in the smile. That same smile she gave even when customers were rude, when the manager barked orders, when the tips didn't come. She was breaking. Quietly. But she never dropped a plate. And without realizing it, Lucas felt something shift in him. Something he hadn't expected when he first put on that old jacket and walked into this place. Admiration. The kind you don't speak aloud. The kind that makes you wonder. What would happen if someone like her had a real chance? He began to return, not to observe the restaurant, but to witness her. And though he still wore the disguise of a man nobody noticed, something inside him, the part of him that had always kept people at a distance, was starting to stir. The lunch rush came on like a storm, voices overlapping, silverware clattering, plates shuffling across tabletops like dominoes. Customers waved impatiently. Kids cried for ketchup. The kitchen bell rang again and again, sharp and relentless, and right in the eye of the chaos, stood Clara. A clipboard in one hand, 2 drink refills in the other, she moved like someone dancing over landmines, focused, fast but fragile. She was everywhere at once, apologizing for a wrong order, running extra napkins, helping a coworker cover a spill. The strain in her eyes was starting to show, but she kept moving. She always kept moving. Until Roberto opened his mouth. Roberto, the manager. A man whose power came not from respect, but from volume. He stormed out from behind the kitchen, his face flushed, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Clara, what the hell is this? Table 9 steak is cold, and you didn't upsell the wine. Again!" All eyes turned. The air snapped silent. The VIP table, corporate men in suits, paused mid-bite. Clara froze. "You want to lose this job? Keep going the way you are. You're costing us money, every damn shift." The words landed like slaps. Clara's face didn't crumble. She stood still, but her knuckles whitened against the tray she held, and in that moment everyone saw it, the effort it took not to break down. Everyone saw, but only one man stood up. From the corner booth, Lucas pushed back his chair and walked across the room. Calm, controlled, but there was steel in his gaze now. Not anger, something colder. He stopped between Roberto and Clara, looked once at her, just enough for her to realize he wasn't just watching anymore. Then he turned. "That's enough," Lucas said, not loud, but firm. "Final. You don't talk to people like that. Not here, not anywhere." Roberto blinked, thrown off by the stranger's nerve. "This doesn't concern you, sir. It does now." The silence that followed was electric. Customers held forks mid-air. Servers paused behind the bar. Clara, stunned, took a half-step back. Her heart raced, not because of the confrontation, but because no one had ever done that for her before. Not in this place, not anywhere. "She's doing the job of 3 people, Lucas added, voice low, gaze locked. "Maybe you should stop yelling and start helping." And just like that, he turned and walked away, like nothing had happened. Later that day, in the narrow staff hallway, Clara caught up with him. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, clutching her apron, the words knotted somewhere between her lungs and her lips. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said, her voice a fragile whisper. "He could fire you. You're just a customer." Lucas looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. Gently. Quietly. But there was something different in his eyes now. Not just interest. Conviction. "Some things," he said, "are worth speaking up for." Clara didn't reply, but her breath hitched, just enough to let the emotion through. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen. A little straighter this time. A little less alone. The day had started like any other. Controlled chaos. Clara moved between tables like a thread pulled tight. Her smile intact, her shoes worn thin, her notepad filled with a dozen scribbles in half-legible shorthand. "Coffee here. Toast dry. No onions. Extra syrup." But beneath her routine there was a strange buzz, like a static charge she couldn't explain. It began when she saw him, Lucas, seated at his usual table, sipping coffee like always. Except this time, he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a man in a crisp navy suit, someone Clara had never seen in the neighborhood before. They spoke in low tones, eyes sharp, postures too formal for casual lunch conversation. She didn't mean to listen. She wasn't trying to snoop. But as she stepped behind the service counter to grab a pitcher of water, she heard it, clear as day. "Yes, Mr. Martins. I've already informed the regional office about your visit." Her hand froze mid-pour. "Mr. Martins?" She glanced back, slowly, cautiously. The suited man was nodding politely. Lucas didn't notice her. He didn't even look in her direction, but something changed in her. Not dramatically, not visibly, but deep in her gut, a quiet voice started whispering. Mr. Martins? He never told me his last name. And why is he meeting with someone from corporate? Who even is he? That whisper became a flicker of heat behind her eyes, a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and something dangerously close to betrayal. Later, while wiping down a booth, Clara kept one eye on Lucas. The way he carried himself suddenly looked different, less casual, less ordinary. She noticed small things now, the way he placed his phone face down every time she approached, how he never paid with a card, how he sometimes showed up during off hours, yet knew the names of every staff member, even the dishwasher. And then came the moment she couldn't unsee. At the end of his conversation, the suited man stood up, reached out his hand, and said clearly, "Thank you for your time, sir. The board's very pleased with how discreet you've been." Lucas gave a curt nod. Clara turned away before they could see her watching. Her heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from a gnawing sense of something being withheld. By the end of her shift, the weight of it had grown unbearable. Lucas had smiled at her as he left, that same warm, familiar smile, and for the first time since she met him, she didn't smile back. Because now every kind gesture felt like a question. Who are you, really? And why didn't you tell me? Trust is fragile. It doesn't always break with a crash. Sometimes it unravels, thread by thread, in silence. It happened at the end of her shift. Not in a grand confrontation, not in public, but in the quiet, echoing stillness of the back alley behind the restaurant, where Clara had followed him out without a word. Lucas turned when he heard the door swing open. She was already there, coat barely on. Eyes locked. "You lied to me." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It landed like a stone in a still pond. Lucas hesitated. His instinct told him to diffuse, to explain, but something in her face stopped him cold. "Clara, how long have you been pretending?" she cut in. "Since the first day? Since the moment you walked in here, what did you see? A project? A case study? Or just some poor girl trying to keep her head above water?" Lucas didn't speak, because he knew this moment wasn't about what he meant to do. It was about how it felt to her. You sat here. You listened. You let me open up. And the whole time, you were the man who could have changed my life with one sentence. Silence. "So why didn't you?" she whispered. There was pain in her voice, yes, but underneath it, worse, humiliation. The feeling of being watched instead of seen, studied instead of supported. Lucas finally stepped closer, his voice low, raw. "Because I wanted to know the truth, not as an owner, as a man. I didn't plan to meet you, Clara, and once I did, I didn't know how to separate the job from what I felt." That stopped her. Just for a second. Enough for something flicker across her eyes. Doubt, hope, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "I don't need your guilt," she said flatly, "and I sure as hell don't need your pity." And with that, she turned and walked away, back into the restaurant, back into the place where she now knew every smile she'd given him had been under false lights. She didn't see what came next. She didn't see Roberto standing nearby, lips curled into a smirk, already pulling out his phone. She didn't hear the whispers he began the next morning, about how Clara had been cozying up to the new boss, how her rise was a result of favor, not work. And by the end of the week, Clara was called into the office. Not for a promotion, but for disciplinary review. No explanation. No discussion. Just a cold, dry statement. "You're being placed on unpaid leave, effective immediately, until further notice." Her hands trembled as she folded her apron, but she didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. Because what hurt more than losing the job was losing the one person who made her believe she mattered. Do you think Lucas deserves forgiveness? Or did he cross a line that can't be undone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The next chapter may surprise you. Lucas never called. He never sent flowers, never knocked on her door, never showed up asking for a second chance, because something inside him, something he hadn't listened to in years, told him the truth. She didn't need to hear anything else. She needed to see something different. So he started with the small things. One morning, the manager who had taken over after Roberto's suspension noticed a stack of sealed pay envelopes on his desk, marked with names of the kitchen crew, each one slightly heavier than usual. A note, handwritten. Retroactive hazard pay. No one should have to survive silence. No signature. 2 days later, the head dishwasher, an older man named Hector, who hadn't taken a full day off in 4 years, was handed a paid weekend off and told his hospital visit for back pain would be covered. Again, no credit given. Just done. At the same time, someone quietly called Clara's landlord, settling 2 months of back rent with instructions never to say who sent it. A tuition payment for her boys suddenly cleared. A school librarian offered the twins a full scholarship to an after-school reading program, one Lucas had funded under a different name. Still, no calls, no notes, no declarations, just acts, quiet ones, intentional ones. And Clara? She noticed. At first, it angered her, because she didn't ask for charity, didn't want handouts wrapped in guilt. But slowly, over days, her anger changed shape. It became confusion, then curiosity, then something harder to admit. Hope. She noticed the way staff began speaking freely during meetings. The air was lighter now, the fear gone. There were family meals again before closing, something she hadn't seen in months. Tips were pooled and split evenly. The culture of hush-hush survival had shifted, not with announcements, but with new habits. And when she passed by the restaurant one afternoon, just passing, she told herself, she saw Lucas from across the street. He wasn't in the owner's office, wasn't talking to investors. He was sitting in a booth alone, sleeves rolled up, wiping menus by hand. A man who had once owned dozens of restaurants, now cleaning like a trainee on day 1. And for the first time since it all shattered, Clara looked at him, really looked, and didn't feel rage, didn't feel shame. She felt something like breath returning to her chest. Sometimes, the most powerful apology isn't a word. It's a changed rhythm, a quiet choice. A second chance earned, not asked for. It happened on a rainy Monday, the kind of morning where everything outside the window looked like watercolor. Inside the restaurant, the lights had already been dimmed, chairs unstacked, aprons tied. But this morning wasn't about prep. The kitchen was quiet. The front door stayed locked, and every employee stood gathered near the back, around the long wooden table that had never seen a staff meeting, until now. At the head of the room stood Lucas, in a simple gray shirt, no blazer, no pretense. His hands were folded in front of him, his eyes calm but direct. And beside him, Clara. She hadn't expected to be there. She had declined his call twice. The third time, he didn't call. He sent a message through someone she trusted, and now she stood beside him, not out of pride, not yet, but out of something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe closure. Lucas cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Many of you know why we're here," he began. "But for those who don't, this place hasn't felt safe in a long time." He didn't name Roberto yet. He didn't need to. "I take full responsibility for not seeing it sooner, for not listening when you needed a voice. That changes today." Then, slowly, he turned toward Roberto, who stood stiff, arms crossed at the edge of the room. a man whose power had lived in fear and silence. "You're dismissed, effective immediately." The room held its breath. Roberto didn't argue. He didn't even speak. He simply walked out. And when the door closed behind him, it felt like air rushing back into a room after a long-held breath. Lucas turned to Clara, his voice softer now, but just as clear. "This team deserves someone who knows their names, who remembers birthdays, who sees people, not positions. Clara, I'd like to offer you the role of general manager." There was no applause. Not yet. The moment hung in the air like a fragile glass sculpture. Beautiful, but not yet unshaken. Clara looked at him, then at the others. She saw faces she'd known for years, faces that once looked at her with indifference, pity, even envy. Now, they looked hopeful. She shook her head gently. "I'm not the right person," she said. "I'm a single mom who barely made rent. I got yelled at in front of this room. I cried in the freezer during rush hour." A beat of silence, and then from the back, a voice broke through. "That's exactly why you're the right person." It was Hector, the dishwasher, the quietest man in the building. Others followed. "You stood up for me when I needed it," said a younger server. "You trained me when no one else cared," added someone from the kitchen. The voices came one by one, soft but certain. Clara blinked. Her hands were trembling. But this time, it wasn't from fear. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's build it better this time. No cheers. No music swell. Just the quiet sound of trust returning, brick by brick, not to Lucas, not to management, but to each other." And Clara, for the first time in years, walked behind that counter not as a survivor, but as a leader. In the weeks that followed, something changed, not suddenly, not all at once, but quietly, like the way spring light softens winter glass. Clara and Lucas began spending time together outside the restaurant. Not dates, not officially, just time. Shared moments, side-by-side conversations, long walks with coffee in hand, mornings spent reviewing schedules, and evenings making lists of what needed fixing next. But underneath the work and the laughter and the easy silences, something unspoken was growing. Lucas, for his part, said nothing. He didn't push. He never crossed the line. But when he looked at Clara, it was always with a gentleness that said more than words ever could. And Clara felt it. Every time he made her laugh without trying. Every time he helped one of her sons with their math homework, more patient than she had energy to be. Every time he stayed late at the restaurant. Not because he had to, but because she did. She felt it everywhere. And yet, she said nothing. One night, after the boys were asleep, she stood at the window of her apartment, arms wrapped around herself, gaze lost in the street lamp haze outside. She thought of what it would mean, to fall in love again. Not the kind she read about in novels, but the kind that required her trust, her time, her whole tired, stretched, too thin self. Could he really understand what it means to love a woman who's always running on empty? What if she let him in? And he left? What if the boys grew attached, and then lost him too? She watched her own reflection in the glass, the outline of a woman learning to hope again, and afraid of what hope might cost. At the restaurant, she noticed Lucas waiting for her near the back one evening, 2 cups of tea in hand, and a smile that wasn't asking for anything. He handed her the cup, and for a while, they just stood there. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise, not wrapped in romance, but in presence. And slowly, Clara began to dream, Not of fairy tales or whirlwind escapes, but of Sundays without stress. Of love that shows up with groceries and sits on the floor folding laundry. Of a future built one quiet day at a time. Because sometimes, love doesn't knock loudly. It waits, just outside the door, until you're ready to let it in. The proposal didn't happen in a grand ballroom or on a windswept hill. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening, just after closing, in the same booth where Clara had first poured Lucas a cup of lukewarm coffee and apologized for the cracked tabletop. The restaurant was empty, the lights dim. The hum of the dish machine in the back was the only sound, until Lucas took a breath, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a simple velvet box. He didn't kneel, he didn't rehearse. He just held it in his palm, looked her in the eye, and said, "I'd rather build one small life with you than 1,000 perfect ones without you." Clara didn't cry. Not then. She smiled, a smile that came from deep inside her ribs, and nodded once. "Yes," she whispered, "we'll build it together." The wedding was held 1 month later, not in a chapel, but right there in the restaurant, closed for the day. The place where it all began, where truth met kindness, where love learned to wait. Clara wore a dress that her co-workers helped her choose. The twins stood proudly at her sides, fidgeting with their ties and handing Lucas their own homemade vows, drawn in crayon. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets. But there was laughter. There was music. There were toasts from dishwashers and cooks and old regulars who had become family. When she walked down the aisle between 2 rows of tables, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And when Lucas kissed her, it wasn't a moment of spectacle. It was one of peace, of finally, of home. Life after that wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Clara returned to work, this time not as a survivor, but as a builder. She helped rewrite the employee handbook. She mentored young hires. She made the place shine, not with polish, but with dignity. Lucas scaled back. He stayed close. He cooked on weekends. He walked the twins to school. And one late spring morning, while folding laundry with her hands still wet from dish soap, Clara told him she was pregnant. They stood in the kitchen, stunned, breathless, grinning like fools. "Another chapter?" he said. "The best one yet?" she answered. And in that moment, a woman once buried by life's weight, and a man once hidden behind his own name, found themselves exactly where they were meant to be. Not chasing success, not running from the past, but holding hands, in the middle of something good. You've followed Clara and Lucas through heartbreak, hope, and healing. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate their story? Drop your score in the comments, and subscribe for more real-life inspired stories that just might bring a tear to your eye.